Hi, I'm Michael Hilkemeyer, and I help primary teachers assess ICT capability. And today, you'll learn how to use the Australian curriculum to not only teach, but assess student ICT capability in your classroom by using practical and immediately actionable strategies that will ensure progression and continuity in student learning. The Australian curriculum has embedded ICT capability as a 21st century skill throughout all learning areas. Its website currently states that teachers are required to teach and assess this general capability to the extent that they are incorporated within the learning area content. Despite this, you are only actually required to assess this general capability if you teach in Victoria. Having said this, the principles and practices which I am about to show you can be used to assess the use of ICT across the curriculum, and so they can be applied also to your own teaching practices elsewhere. As a teacher, you may also apply the use of ICT in content learning areas where you feel that it may enhance or support the learning of students. In the example I'm about to show you, I will be using the English discipline from the Australian curriculum from Foundation to Year 2. Let's get started. Okay, to start with, you need to go to the Australian curriculum website, and we're going to look at the English discipline. So to go to there, we need to click on the F to 10 curriculum and scroll down to English and click on that. Next, because we're going to look at individual years starting at Foundation Year, we'll just click on Foundation Year, and then we'll just leave the strands by itself because we'll be looking at all the strands. But as we are only looking at the general capability ICT, we need to just focus our attention on that. So we deselect all and we select ICT capability, and then click on the submit button. And there you can see, if I scroll down, the Foundation Year for the English discipline. Now the ICT capability icon is located in both the language and the literacy. So let's have a look at those together. If we were to click on the elaborations, we will be able to see the breakdown of this curriculum activity. And we're focusing on the ICT capability part. So looking at down here where the icon is again, and if you look above, you can see the key skills which students in the foundation year of learning will need to learn. So for example, be involved in the keyboard, mouse, being able to typing letters, scrolling, selecting icons, and the drop-down menu. You may even wish to add a few more if you think the students are capable of doing that. If you click on the icon, you can see how it will link this activity to the learning continuum. In this case, it is managing and operating ICT, where students will select and use hardware and software. That is just for language. For the literacy part, the same applies, and it's more involved here into the ICT capability, where it says to construct text using software, including word processing programs for this type of activity. However, even if you feel that students are capable of exploring another software, such as presentation software, like Microsoft PowerPoint, you can use that program as well. However, I would recommend sticking to just word processing. At this stage, they are still developing the LE skills, the LE capabilities. So again, if I was to go and click on the elaborations, I can see the breakdown of this activity. And like I said, it's more focused on the ICT capability part. And the key skills here are listed and are the same as are in the language strand. And again, by clicking on the icon, you can see the link to the learning continuum. Now, I'll show you how this can be used in your planning later on. Okay, so let's deselect that again. Alright, so there it shows you the key skills. Scrolling down now, I'm going to focus specifically on the sample work portfolios there. And I always like to have higher expectations of my students when it comes to using ICT. And this should be a key strategy that you should use too. When I do that, I also have an appreciation of the problems likely to be experienced by the students and have planned strategies in place ready to deal with those problems. In addition, I would also be teaching this activity by first going through either working with the class in the whole class or as a group beforehand, where I would clarify my expectations, and I will also focus their intention on what they are going to do and how they might go about it, in addition to demonstrating any key techniques involved. I would introduce this activity by explanation and questioning, and then I will conclude by further questioning and a clear summary of what has been learned. So let's look at one of these work sample portfolios, and I'll choose the above satisfactory because it sets a high standard. So the sample portfolio that I'm going to choose, is the one on the character story, Mr. Happy. If I scroll down there, the summary of the task states that students discussed characters in text they had listened to. They were asked to select a favorite character and to invent a new story for that character. The teacher modeled the task and students told the new stories to others in groups. Finally, students wrote and illustrated their character stories. So how can this be applied to our teaching strategies? How can we then learn from this example of the curriculum to teach and assess ICT capability? Let's look at that now. When it comes to teaching and assessing ICT capability, teacher knowledge of software is vital. And it is more important for you to be knowledgeable about one program than it is to have acquaintances with many. This does not limit the student's development, however. It is better for the students to work with a small number of versatile programs and progressively develop their skills and confidence in these through carefully structured activities than it is to try to learn how to use a large number of programs superficially. So even though while it says you can use word processing programs, if you do feel students are capable of using another program, you can do that. But focus your attention on something that you can really expand the knowledge on first. And in this case, as the Australian curriculum recommends, it will be word processors. So let's continue. And what I'm going to talk to you about now is how you can use the Australian curriculum in your planning. Well, first of all, as I've mentioned, you can see there the list of skills that is required for you to teach and assess. It's put there right there in front of you. How can they be used? Well, now I'd like to introduce you to something called the activity planning sheet. Now this planning sheet is fantastic because it can be used by senior management to keep track of the implementation of ICT. It can assist you in your future planning. It can inform the teacher of the next age group of what work has been covered. And it can also inform supply teachers too if you are away. In addition, it can also show any discrepancies between what was planned and what was actually taught. Let's take a closer look. I've taken an example straight from the sample work portfolios of the Australian curriculum. In this case, it's the above satisfactory example of the character story. Now here, I've listed the foundation year, the year level. I've made the connection between the learning continuum. I've put the topic, which is the character story, the subject. And this is where your planning comes into action. By keeping records of this, you can really nail down progression for these students. In this, I've listed the activity as such for students to be using a word processor like Microsoft Word to type a single sentence or word from their own character story. They will add text and develop their word processing skills. They will save their work at the completion of the activity. That's pretty straightforward. Whatever you have planned for them to be able to accomplish this activity. So in other words, what the student is doing here is taking the written story of their character, and now you're going to get them to type them up using a word processor, which will enhance their literacy language skills, as well as enhance their ICT capability. The next part there is grouping. And when it comes to ICT work, specifically for this particular year level, grouping is very important. Collaboration works very well in ICT situations. When it comes to grouping though, you do need to be careful about how you actually pair the students together. And you need to consider the differences in the ICT capability of the students, the sex of the students, depending on whether you teach at a co-ed school or at a single-sex school, the nature of the task, and also the personalities of the students. So those are the things that you need to consider when it comes to grouping. Now for the assessment, I've taken those key skills straight from their website. These are the key skills that these students will need to learn in this activity. And if you do feel that the students are more capable of some other skills, then you can add them onto them. Because it's always better to challenge them intellectually in these activities. So, for example, in this type of activity, when the students will be typing up the letters, the words or sentences, however you want to structure this activity, they could be locating the keys on the keyboard. Can they type letters and words? Can they move the mouse to an appropriate icon? Can they select an icon and with a mouse, can they click and drag the scroll bar or use a mouse wheel to scroll? And can they click the drop down menu? So this is an excellent example of how you can use the curriculum for your planning. Where do you go from here? Well, the next step then is to monitor them. And it's best to monitor the key components of ICT capability. For example, the routines, the techniques, the processes, and the higher order skills. Okay, so the routines can be recognized by the ease and the speed with which familiar techniques can be carried out, and it's best to monitor them using a brief checklist of techniques that students should be able to use and should be able to use routinely. Techniques, the same sort of technique can be used to do this, and it will involve a checklist for each class to enable yourself to keep track of which students are confident in using the techniques. It is important to give those students needing help only the minimum amount of support, because students can often remember techniques or work them out themselves with little prompting concerning whether to look for options. So this support should be withdrawn as soon as possible. Processes are generally made up of several techniques, and it's best to provide scaffolding here. The scaffolding needs to be withdrawn as soon as possible to see what the students can achieve unaided. Then there is higher order skills, where it involves independent use of the tools and the context. So you could either go through and first, you can teach the model techniques of the strategic planning by thinking out aloud in front of students, or you could either give groups of students responsibility for planning a task and coach them by focusing questions at intervals to guide students towards a viable plan. Or you could involve the students socially in planning, monitoring, evaluating, and reflecting through whole class teaching. I know for foundation that these steps might not be appropriate, but it's something to keep in mind. Moving forward now, looking at those assessment items that you're going to assess, best process I would use a process where you would individually test the students on every key skill there, and I've listed them down on the left hand side there. So as you go through and do the activity, whenever a student does complete an activity, is able to achieve these techniques, you list the date, and then you'd also go through and set for determining how a student was able to achieve those techniques. For example, were they hesitant? Were they steady? Were they fluent? And this sort of monitoring and checklist is great, because then you can then plan for plan future activities for students to be able to help them progress from hesitant to steady to fluent users of that technique. Another way you could go through from here is through a class recording sheet. So from this one here, which is an individual one, then you can then list how students would go through using them as a whole class, stating the learning objectives, which in this case will be the techniques, and the numbers represent the students as listed in the above student list. And then you go through and you check using this code here. One tick would indicate some grasp but needs further reinforcement. 2 ticks, basic grasp, and then 3 ticks, sound grasp. So they will all be included in each student's box there. And finally, the third approach, again, will be using different checking points. And it's very similar to the one I just mentioned. We have a code. And this one was a code where 1 stroke would mean needs more help. Partial understanding would indicate this. And a triangle like this would indicate full understanding. So you would list the techniques here, and then down one side you have the student names, and the numbers would indicate the techniques achieved, and here you would mark appropriately whether they have partial, some understanding, partial understanding, or full understanding of the technique. And that's how you would use, and that's how you would assess the ICT capability. So as you can see, by clicking on the elaborations and then looking at the key skills that it mentions there, and also by linking it to the learning continuum, you can not only plan effectively for the teaching and assessing of ICT capability, but you can also develop student ICT capability effectively. So even if we look now at Year 1 and Year 2 and click Submit, we scroll down again, you see there the digital skills, the key skills that students will need to learn, and the icon present for every elaboration there included. Okay, so again for Year 2, clicking on the elaborations, you can see the key skills that you can use in your planning. And what I'd like to point out here is that there are gaps in the learning continuum that you need to be able to determine the intermediate skill level of these capabilities of these students. So that's how I would strongly encourage you to use the sample portfolios here in the Australian curriculum. Now, if you want to learn more about teaching and assessing ICT capability, I would encourage you to enroll in my self-paced online courses on open learning, all which are for teaching ICT capability and for assessing ICT capability. And as you can see, they are accredited professional development through NESA, covering or addressing the standards 2.6.2 and 5.1.2 and 3.4.2. In addition to that, if you want to continue your professional learning towards teaching ICT capability, I encourage you to go and check out my website, where I have hundreds of articles on how you can teach, assess, and develop student ICT capability. Well, that now concludes this video. I hope you've learned a lot from it and taken a lot from it. And if you feel you need more advice, please don't hesitate to contact me through my website here. I'll be happy to answer any questions for you.